So yeah, I'm very happy to be here with Alexandra, whose work really is, I think, quite it manages to be very wide-ranging because it moves between participation, sculpture, performance. She's also interested in digital technology, which overlaps with some of my current interests. She's also moved between dance, theatre, film, music, and visual art contexts. And I think this year has been a year of some quite big commissions and high-profile events for her. She had a big piece in Athens that I thought was part of Documenta 14, but is not. She's got a big new commission in Munster that opens at the end of this week, and then a piece for Impulse Theatre Festival that opens in 2.5 weeks, and which will also then go on to St. Petersburg later in the year. So I'm going to break this up maybe into 3 areas so that we have some kind of manageable structure for the evening. Hopefully it won't get too digressive. The first bit I wanted to maybe group questions around performance and visual art, then secondly around performance and public space, and then thirdly around performance and digital technology. And so, because I have to leave at precisely 8:30, we're going to speak for a little bit, less than an hour, and open it up to questions. And I hope that's okay with everyone. So, hi.
Hi, and thank you, Claire, for being here, and thanks, Florian, for the invitation.
So the first thing I want to ask you is whether you can talk about your transition from your dance training. You studied ballet, and earlier you showed me a fantastic picture of yourself doing a beautiful jeté, aged 18, with her legs. I mean, you cannot imagine. I mean, they're so far apart. And how did you make this transition then from a classical dance training into doing conceptual types of performance in the visual art context? And I realize that's probably covering a lot of years and that has the potential to be very detailed. So I'm going to ask you to maybe choose 3 key events that mark that transition for us.
Well, I think I realized at some point, I mean, not so late actually, but during high school I was on a scholarship at the Vienna State Opera Ballet School, that I don't want to do this for the rest of my life, and this is limiting a lot of what I could do and what I could be interested in. So the first decision was to go to the University for Drama and Film in Romania and to attend this newly opened choreography section after I finished the school in Vienna. So basically not to get into the opera house, not to pursue a classical ballet career. So to enter this choreography section at the University for Drama and Film in Romania. It was a quite boring experience, so it didn't really interest me anymore after the first year, but I met some really interesting people and very, very interesting dancers and choreographers that were just then creating this new institution for contemporary dance in Romania, the National Dance Center, which still exists actually, and they're co-producing the work also for here. So this would be, I guess, one event. And then I think there was this other moment. So for a couple of years I made work for theater, and I showed work in mostly theatrical context, meaning actually, in situations where you have a stage and an audience and there's something like a fourth wall between these two realms. And then in 2008, no, actually in 2010, there was a moment when the National Dance Center was evacuated from this really beautiful space within the National Theatre in Romania. Because of the financial crisis and because of a sudden, the main reason was that the government is cutting funding for the arts. So this institution cannot get funding anymore, and actually we need this space to do something else with it and so on. So it was basically just thrown out on the street, and we staged a sort of like an Occupy action at that moment, and together with a couple of friends and artist colleagues, and mostly dancers, I proposed this action. I mean, it was my proposal, and then we performed it together to embody a sculpture that was outside the National Theatre that was just being installed there. It costed around 2 million euros. It was this huge bronze sculptural ensemble, also very ugly. We don't have images, but it was just again made by one of these famous Romanian sculptors that would get all the commissions for public space monuments, and he had his own I don't know how you call, like oven or production company. So it was also about making a lot of money with it. And yeah, so basically I proposed that we embody this sculpture for a couple of days in a row. And we just spend time there a couple of hours every day. And it started as let's say, like a political gesture in a sense. Basically saying that if this is the only type of art that gets recognition and funding, well, we can perform this as well, and we produce a more interesting version and let's say a cheaper version, and it's more flexible. And then I was also interested in this tension between materialities, between this also overscaled or big-scaled work and the human bodies. So we started performing this for a couple of days there, and that's when I met also Raluca Voina, who was the curator of the Romanian Pavilion in Venice 2 or 3 years later. And that's how somehow I also moved more into, let's say, the visual arts. I think not necessarily the white cube. I work just as much in the public space or in somehow other spaces as in the white cube, but it's mostly visual arts context where I also realized, or at least at that point for me, was I could experiment with more formats and with different types of display and with different temporalities and durations. And, yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm glad you brought up Venice, because I think that's the moment when most people became aware of your work. When you filled the Romanian pavilion, maybe occupied the Romanian pavilion with a group of 5 or 6 performers. And the work was called An Immaterial History of the Venice Biennale, right?
Retrospective, yeah.
A retrospective, okay. Immaterial retrospective of the Venice Biennale, which you did with Manuel Pelmuș, who's also a choreographer from Bucharest. Something that that I want to ask in relationship to that piece, and thinking of you coming from a classical dance training, is what happens to virtuosity when you relocate into a gallery space and you have to sustain a performance over the exhibition hours for the duration of 6 months. There's been a lot of discussion around de-skilling in dance, but do you think virtuosity gets displaced into other forms and other types of competences that need to be mobilized in order to create that kind of work? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, it's a nice topic, and I think when I was part of your program at the Rietveld, we touched on this a bit. In classical ballet repertoire, you also have, for example, you have Swan Lake. It's a 4.5-hour ballet. It's really hard to dance for everybody, including the soloist, but also the ensemble. So in the exhibition space, I think that the longest duration that I and with Manuel as well, we worked with was 4 hours for the performers. And of course, it's like an everyday job, right? And of course, you don't perform something that is traditionally virtuosic, in a sense of, doing something very spectacular. I guess that I became less and less interested in beautiful bodies and very toned and, in these abstract, beautiful geometries, because I did this for 8 years. And at some point, I also know what it implies. I also know what type of...
What does it imply?
Well, it's not just a lot of work. It's, I think, maybe I'm abusing this word, but it is a sort of fascism of the body. So you have this standard, and again, you have Randy Martin talking about kinestems and systems of movement, and how ballet, the classical ballet, was basically conceived by Louis XIV, if I'm not mistaken, because he was facing this strange political situation, and he wanted to gain more control over his vassals, like his, court. So you create this system, and then everybody has to mold to that and has to bring their body into that system. So it's quite anti-democratic in a sense. And not everybody can perform that, of course. And if nobody has a perfect body for it, so there's always this process of reshaping your body from a very early age into something that is considered to be, desirable, and that is actually very prohibitive for a lot of other bodies, and that always implies not the work, but also a lot of suffering, and you just take all these screams from teachers and hits, and it's I don't want to go there, But it's especially, I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on the method, but also in Vienna I had a Russian teacher. It's very tough. It basically, it functions on this principle of breaking you apart also psychologically and then putting you back together again. And 99% of the people in my class did not really continue to study ballet. So I guess that's why this type of aesthetic and this idea of beauty became less and less interesting to me, although I do somehow remain interested in this idea of discipline, or that you have to sometimes push yourself, but of course to comfortable limits. So I think sustaining work, performative work, not only in the gallery space but also on stage, even if it's not so technically demanding, has a lot to do with awareness and focus. So I think for now, this is what I work mostly with, also with the performers that I work with at the moment, or I have previously worked with. Just, you know, keeping focus there for hours in a row and keep being aware of your body for that long and aware of what it produces.
But I would say, is that so different to doing a performance every night on stage? You're still focusing. I guess what I'm pushing you towards is whether we can understand virtuosity by other means. For example, being an articulate spokesperson for your work, right? Which is not the case for a ballerina. Doesn't have to be able to talk and frame and position her work, place it within an art historical or a performance historical context.
I mean, I don't look at talking about my work as a necessity. I mean, I do understand that it becomes a necessity today, but I think I became more comfortable with it because I was genuinely interested in being able to produce my own discourse also around what I do. So in being able to negotiate how discourse is produced around your work so that you're not just, you know, and again, this is also a problem, I think, with dance and choreography that but that you're not really expected to be able to talk, right? Because you move, or you move your legs, so you shouldn't be able to move your brain. Also, that's why I was giving this example of this Yvonne Rainer piece, "The Mind is the Muscle," also at the Rietveld. So I think this is also a choreographical practice in a sense, and it's about how you think about your work, and it helps the work also. For me, it helps me articulating the work. So thinking about it or writing about it helps the work. So yeah, of course, it's a different type of virtuosity, but I don't think you necessarily see this in how the performers embody the work.
Yeah, no, I think these other types of virtuosity are also behind the scenes, and they're behind the work. And another one, I've just come from a 3-day conference at the Tanzhaus, and another one that was brought up was a question of being able to function, indeed thrive within a neoliberal project-based economy, of moving from project to project. And this is certainly maybe true more for the dancers and performers than it is for the artist, to be able to manage these short-term contracts that nevertheless require you to move to a different city and commit your life to this particular piece for a short term. So maybe you could speak about the people that you employ in your work, because I know they're a mix of people who are trained with dance and people who are not. But beyond that, I don't have any more specific information.
I mean, I think it's a complicated issue because then again, you can easily critique, right, this model, you know, of this precarious model of employment. And on the other hand, I mean, what would be the alternative? Because also working only with companies, there's still a lot of dance companies, and it's not like they always produce very interesting work, and most of the times they do produce actually the same work over and over again. So, of course, there are advantages and disadvantages that come with flexibility, and one of the disadvantages is, of course, precarity. On the other hand, I think you can, of course, you know, try out different methods of work and work with different choreographers, which is also nice and interesting. So you don't spend 20 years in a company doing the same work over and over again. Yeah, actually, there is one performer here that I work with, and it would also be interesting at the end if she has something to say about any other new experiences or how she feels about it. But yeah, I try to keep track or to keep a group of people that I have previously worked with and to also bring them into new works. I think usually the ideal situation is a mix between people that I've worked with and new people. I do get invited to make work in different contexts, so I always meet new performers. But yes, I don't know. What?
The only thing I would maybe push you to then say more about is when you were talking about body types and the fascism of the body in dance training, and whether you make an effort to diversify that norm.
No, I do, and there's usually, for example, there is no age limit or body limit whenever I meet new people. I don't really make castings or auditions, it's mostly informal meetings. I do make another work now. I have a solo show in Berlin for which I employ 90 people, and again, they're very diverse. What I wanted to say, also talking with performers, I also performed in other works and also in my work, so I'm also aware of what it feels to be employed as an interpreter. Also talking with other people, for a lot of performers, it's also good to be employed for 2 months or 4 months. So actually these longer term exhibitions with performative works do offer some sort of course it's not an ideal situation, but it's a bit more stability than if you do 2 shows, somewhere, and then for the other 3 months you don't know whether you'll be able, Of course there are different ways of paying, and it's a bit more complicated, but yeah, I'm also thinking, for example, of a system of shareholding in the work for performers. So that, if we talk about finance and derivatives, so that the future circulation of the work also benefits the people that are, investing in it. Yeah. Because I think most of the art world functions on debt. Yeah. So on this kind of investment that you make, and then it's up to you to transform it into liquidity at some point. So I'm trying to take on some of that responsibility, but of course it's very complicated because it's not just up to the artist or even the curator, but then to what kind of institutions you can work with that are willing to take on this as well, and to take like a burden. So, if someone, let's say, was not extraordinarily well paid now, maybe for the next installation of the work, you can actually, the institution and the artist takes on that you pay this debt to these other performers. So you add something to the budget in able to cover,
That's fascinating. I really like the idea that you're trying to devise a new model for the economic circulation of the work. The whole turn of the visual arts and museums being interested in performance, which I think started around in the early 2000s, is something that is, it shows no signs of slowing down. And I guess what I wanted to ask you about that, so the question came to my mind while you were speaking, and now it's completely vanished, is, yes, okay, so historically, performance in a visual arts context has been somewhat antagonistic to a history of theatre and performance. In the terms of the performing arts. Hence the emphasis on, for example, no rehearsals, a certain spontaneity, maybe even a certain amateurism, which was always positioning itself against the professionalization of the performing arts. And I think the turn that we've seen since the millennium is that then instead we have the performing arts moving into a visual arts context, and that sense of antagonism between visual art performance and the institution seems to be dissipating in favor of a mode of performance that is much more professionalized and collaborative, and and implies something completely different in terms of an institutional critique. And it seems to me that if there is any institutional critique around it, it's in the things that maybe you've gestured towards about how the work circulates, the economies around it. At the same time, it's also found a way to be acquired by museums in the last 10 years. So I guess I want to ask you like a very general question about why you think performance has become so popular in museums. And then there's a part 2, but let's deal with that one first.
I mean, for sure it has a lot to do with this new attention economy and this economy of the event, and for a change in attention span with the audience and with digital technologies as well. And again, this change in how how much time you're willing to invest in something, and how you get used to be engaged all the time. So I think from this contemplative mode of walking through the gallery and stopping and spending time to look at an object, you're more and more used to being approached and engaged, and I think, of course, museums they are trying to catch up with that and to produce experiences. There's also this experience economy and animation and something that is engaging the audience and that you can Instagram and then you can, say that you were part of this event. So of course it has something to do with that, a lot to do with that actually.
That's also quite a cynical reading. Yeah? Is there a desire on the part of artists as well?
Yeah, no, and for sure.
And what is that desire? Because
No,
there's enough artists willing to do this. Yeah?
Yes, and I think there's also some genuine interest on the part of institutions, and I'm more like I'm trying to recognize, let's say, a more impersonal drive or something that you get affected by no matter what. But of course, there are different curators, different institutions, and different ways of approaching that, and you can sense that in how the invitation is being made. You know, from I think at the beginning or a couple of years ago, it was a lot about offering, or the most invitations I would get were a lot about, you know, something for the opening. We have this 1,000 euro budget. We open the exhibition, something for the opening, that you draw some attention, and there's, you know, there's an event. And I think it changed also, so more people are also interested in providing longer formats for performative works. I think there's some genuine interest in a different encounter, so that the audience encounters something different. And again, experience economy, I guess it depends what kind of experience you invite. And yeah, as an artist, I'm also interested in that.
Your work is very stripped down. I mean, there's not a lot of, you know, special lighting or amplification. It really is a kind of degree zero of bodies in space producing gestures. Would you say then, I mean, so I don't think that you fall into this, this characterization of performance as spectacularization at all. Is that a conscious position of resistance on your part?
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking about this word. I'm a bit, I don't really like this word, resistance, anymore. I mean, I'm more interested in attack, to be honest. Okay. And at the same time, I think it's been used, you know, so much and by people who really, I mean, they have nothing to do with politics.
So what kind of attack do you think? Let's take your work public collection, which actually is in a public collection, right? It's in the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, and which is an archive of how many works that are in the repertoire?
Public collection has, I think, around 50 works, but it's also it's a mutable structure, so it can transform and, let's say, hybridize.
And it adapts according to where it's
shown.
Yeah,
exactly.
So that it reflects works that are in the collection.
Yes, and for example,
performed by people.
Yes, and somehow placed together with other works that me and Manuel chose. And the version that is also acquired, that was acquired by the Van Abbe Museum, is called Public Collection of Modern Art. And it was part of an exhibition that looked at modernity at large. So again, it includes, for example, a lot of manifestos among artworks, because yeah, we saw that this is a format that is very much related to modernity. So it's quite different from other public collections.
And then you recite part of the manifesto rather than assume a pose or that relates to a figurative or abstract.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that also what we were trying to follow in Venice, and in terms of embodiment, it also followed my previous interest with this contrast of materialities and of size also. So also this process of downscaling and demonumentalizing. Which I think was somehow intrinsic in public collection, also in this immature retrospective of the Venice Biennial. What I somehow noticed then, as the public collection circulated, so first we received a lot of invitations to, for example, to perform retrospectives, because I think there was something, again, very appealing in the work. The fact that it could be very much read only as an homage, you know,
like
to art history, yeah. So, yeah, that's why, for example, I then made delicate instruments handled with care and so on. But I thought that there was something intrinsically, you know, critical, but not in an easy way. But this downscaling and this even, yeah, making things maybe more pop or more accessible or even more low-key that I liked about the works, and that I was interested in. And in that sense, I think it's not so much about resistance. I never pretended, I don't know, I make very radical political work. I think a lot of people who do maybe miss. I mean, for the moment, I'm actually more interested in politics as infrastructural changes. So something that could attack, let's say, the way that the work then circulates and the way that the work then produces value, and for whom and around what.
Okay, well, I think we'll come back to that, but one more question about public collection. I saw it in Kassel at the Fridericianum 2 years ago, And one question that I had watching it was who this work is for. Because as an art historian, I took great delight in seeing the interpretation of well-known works of art. Like Tatlin's Monument to the Third International was one of my favorites. But I wonder, is it a piece that speaks to an audience that is already familiar with art history?
Not necessarily. I like to think that it doesn't have to be shown to a public that is familiar with art history, actually. But of course, I don't know. The feedback that we also got in Venice, and then sometimes with public collection, was that people felt it's very accessible. Also because you actually had the announcement, so you knew what you were looking at. The works that were enacted were announced before the enactment. And then, I don't know, there are situations that are, really do not imply that you need to recognize the work. I'm just going to give an example. There is this enactment of Joseph Beuys' work, which is called Plight. It's an installation, it's a room that is lined with these thick rolls of felt, so it produces a warm atmosphere. And there's a grand piano in the room with a thermometer on it. And this is the whole installation. So the sensation that you get is of, quietness and warmth, and you feel both somehow isolated from the outside environment, but also protected. And the way the performance enacted is basically they open their hands like this, and they offer to the audience an experience of the installation, and then basically they just cover your ears with the palm of their hands. And I think it produces a similar sensation and a similar experience. So it's a complete translation in terms of form of the initial work. And I don't think of course, if you know the work, you can read everything with an added or on a different layer, but I think it's also about a very direct experience of something, and you don't need to know what it is. And I think it's still interesting for people, just to... It's also very accessible, I guess, because of the medium, because you see these other bodies that arrange and configure themselves in these situations, and somehow it feels close to you and accessible.
Okay, let's talk about your works in public space. You mentioned the piece in Bucharest outside the National Dance Centre. And responding to the bronze sculpture that was installed there. You've done other works in Bucharest that also respond to public sculpture. And as well as, I know you don't like the word reenacting, but I'm not sure what else, I guess it's enacting is the word that you prefer, yeah? Of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in Biel in 2014, where a line of people stand in recreating a tilted arc, but of course moving whenever the traffic needed to come through. Do I have a question about that? I'm not sure. Why public space? Why are you interested in dealing with that environment, which is more it's less controllable, it's less spectatorship is more unpredictable. I guess I'm answering the question for you, but do you?
To take as an example the work in Bilbien, this enactment of Tilted Arc, and actually, the only reason why I prefer enactment to reenactment is I think technically the work was never acted out before, so it was just produced in a different material, so this is when it's acted out, but otherwise, I think the whole point with the work, so basically you had this arc made of live presence of people instead of this huge steel structure that would block any passage and would choreograph very aggressively the movement of the people in the square. So this time you had something that is flexible and that you could negotiate with. And
did audiences try and move through the work?
Yes, this was interesting because again it was there for 2 hours every day for 5 days in a row, and you had all kinds of reactions. People just trying to go under, or like simply moving around, or even someone trying to break through, or someone asking the people, can you please just step aside? And of course they do just step aside. And cars that wait, that try to go around, or that wait for a long time until someone comes down, or until the performers decide to really open the arc for them. So yeah, it triggers different reactions, and I think this was the point, that basically you reveal public space in the action, and public space is only public when it's actually negotiated, so when it's still open for negotiation. And yes, this is interesting for me as an environment. It's also, yeah, it's something that you always negotiate also with the passers-by, with the, not to mention with authorities, with the police. And, you know, I'm also interested in all the legal aspects of obtaining an authorization to do something somewhere. So it's never really guerrilla-like. And you have very different kinds of audiences. And actually some of the most interesting feedback that I got on works were also from just passerbys, you know, that I even asked this lady once, I'm like, you're an art historian? And she's like, no. But she was, yeah, giving some really interesting feedback on a very abstract, minimal work.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned delicate instruments, which a version of which is going to be performed here in 2.5 weeks. The earlier version was called Delicate Instruments Handled with Care, correct? Yeah. And then the one that will be performed here is called Delicate Instruments of Engagement. Right? Both of which, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, involve a repertoire of gestures taken from the public sphere, yeah? From media, from pop culture, from political events, and so on. Could you talk about the differences between the two works? And then I think I'd like to ask you more about the politics of gesture and how you arrive at those, at that archive of movements.
So the first work, it's Delicate Instruments Handled with Care, was commissioned within a festival in Brut in Vienna that was centered around the notion of care. So my proposal was that we offer ourselves as instruments with which the audience can work, and they can create all these narratives, or they can, let's say, choose what they like to remember and what they like to have embodied and enacted from a surrounding reality that actually reaches them in a different medium.
But just to be precise, because I haven't seen the work, but I'm very interested in your description of the work, there is a menu of movements and gestures.
Yes,
or
there is a list of possible enactments, and then I was also part of the work. It's for performers, and we perform them upon request. Yes, so this is quite important actually for that work, that nothing happens in the space unless people ask for something. It's a work for the black box, so it functions in a theater, but without this audience and stage divide, so there are no chairs, it's just an empty black box. The people can come in and go out whenever they like, they can stay for how much they like. And
can you give an example of the kind of gestures that are included as part of the repertoire of this piece?
Yeah, we had, I don't know, from Nadia Comaneci gymnastic exercise in the Olympics in '76, where she gets a 10, to a Beyonce video, to a speech of Bill Clinton apologizing for his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, to a monologue from, since we had talked about in the anime convention, from the older Ghost in the Shell anime movie, to a, just very different situations. The Pussy Riot prayer in the Cathedral of Christ in Moscow. Yeah, it's around 50-something situations. You know.
And the same situations will be available as part of Delicate Instruments of Engagement?
No, actually there are very few that overlap. It's mostly new material. And actually the invitation came through this connection with Düsseldorf, and of course we looked at Beuys, and what was interesting for me in relationship to Beuys was also this concept of social sculpture and Gesamtkunstwerk, and how it might have been already manifested today in not such positive ways, you know. And then I was thinking of this viral photograph of this terrorist shooting the Russian ambassador, you know, in a gallery space, in a white cube, and this image that, you know, looked as if it was taken from a, you know, a piece.
Like performance art.
Yes, of course. And then you had also previously, and I included, and I was also interested in that, this situation with the stabbing at Art Basel, that was also mistaken for a performance art piece. So, of course,
So you've included these?
Yes, but you're not supposed to know.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, in this new work, actually, the references are not made visible. So you don't know.
So the audience will not be choosing?
No.
Instead, how are they sequenced?
So there are some narratives that I constructed with certain dramaturgies, and then the audience can choose new beginnings. And then the enactments are reorganized differently. They're also different, but some of them are the same, and then they're part of different narratives, and they are reorganized differently so as to produce new connections and new readings of these specific historical events or pop culture events.
And so how do you do the research for a piece like this? Apart from, you know, scrolling through websites and being sensitive to memes.
Yeah, there are also some memes included, but I don't think, I mean, the research happens somehow before the work. I realize there are all these images that somehow stay in my mind, and these situations and fragments and bits and pieces of reality. I'm also interested in how information becomes more and more abstract, and it flows, you know, in more and more abstract ways, and how you receive it in more fragmented ways. So I think that by trying to produce something like a small overview of all these events and creating links and connections between them, you also get some perspective on history. I don't know, because history then I think becomes also such a short-term concept.
But it seems as if your choices are all from a relatively short historical period, at least with the previous.
Not so. I mean, for example, I forgot to mention in the previous Delicate Instruments, there are also, you know, there's an enactment of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and there's also a speech of Salvador Allende, for example, for this. I mean, it's not so ancient, but yeah.
Okay, and then could you? I mean, does the structure that you've devised for the work that's coming up in Düsseldorf, how does that relate to the piece you did in Athens, Parthenon Marbles?
I don't think it does.
Well, I mean, you also have a team of 4 or 5 performers in a space, you know, in a public space, but then also in a gallery, and it's, I mean, also assuming postures, also occasionally speaking.
Yeah. I mean, yes. If it's I thought about something else when you said structure. Yes, it's also an enactment-based work. Parthenon Marbles, the work that was commissioned by Future Climates, this platform in Athens, together with Cadiz in Paris. Actually looks at this very controversial is a nice word, situation of the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum that are under a request for repatriation to Greece. There's even a museum in Athens, this Acropolis Museum, that was specifically built to host the marbles. And of course to silence these arguments, you know, related to a lack of infrastructure to show global heritage and so on. And it also has a story that the performers speak out during their enactment. So they basically enact all this ensemble of sculptures from the British Museum, the way it is displayed in this Duveen gallery in the British Museum, while telling this speculative story about a potential relocation of the marbles through this concept of a financial derivative, where actually you can create value through circulation independent from the underlying asset and from solid capital. So you extract something from there, and you create a derivative of the actual asset, and then you circulate that, and you're able to produce value with that. So I think it has a quite different focus in a sense.
And then, so maybe then we're using the word structure in a different way. So that's organized. That's more narrative.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
Yeah.
It's nice if you follow it through from the beginning to the end, for example. And actually, my proposal was to show it in the Acropolis Museum. After a long period of negotiations, or I'm not even sure, they actually gave an answer. That at some point they said they're not interested in contemporary art and they don't want to have anything performative of contemporary in the museum. I also wanted to perform it on the Acropolis. So the gallery space was actually a compromise. I don't really think it belongs in a gallery space. We performed it on the Acropolis once, right in front of the Parthenon. And then, the other 3 days in a gallery space.
So this is a great segue to the last section, because I want to talk about digital technology and social media, because I only know this work from Instagram, and it's very striking. Yeah? The performers are in great, bright colors. I mean, the Acropolis is, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better backdrop for a performance work. It looks great. On the other hand, as you'll see, we have no images here, in part because of this enormous window, and it's very hard to organize projections here. But on the other hand, because you said, actually, I don't like showing video when I'm doing a talk.
It was also because this is recorded then, and I think it's supposed to be shown in the exhibition, and I never show documentation of work. I don't sell documentation of work.
Right.
So.
Okay. And so, but nevertheless, there is a large circulation of some form of documentation that is produced through people taking photographs on their phones and circulating it through social media platforms. What do you see as the, I mean, is there a significant difference between those two things? I mean, I know I guess maybe I'm trying to drag you back to a discourse that that is no longer relevant, which is that of immediacy and mediation. And I know you're more interested in abstraction versus materiality. Yeah, you're shifting it to this different poles. But still, I wonder if given that your work is already translating and mediating a series of gestures into the body, is it strange to then think that their remediation into photographic or video form is that much of a transgression?
I mean, I think the work that I try to do remediates, but it remediates through the body, and this is quite important still. So in that sense, I'm not sure that the discussion between immediacy and mediation is completely over, insofar as immediation means just a different type of medium, but that is still very important, I think, because this is still, I mean, our concept of self is very much determined by this perceptory and sensorial apparatus that we still inhabit. And it's still crucial in how we understand and make sense of the world. So I do think that encountering a work that displays or proposes an encounter with bodies rather than a screen is, of course, a very different type of experience. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it's a very different experience, and I think it's still very important to have. So part of the work of remediation that I propose, I think, has to do with making sense of fragments of our reality that circulate in different types of mediums, that are framed differently and contextualized differently, and that I try to not take control, but to frame differently through this medium of the body. So the body is still very much important, and so is the live experience. And then I think it's different when I post a photograph on Instagram. I also don't make specifically Instagrammable work. For example, the work for last year's Berlin Biennale, because it was in a black box and it only had these slides that would reflect these reflective markers on some performers' motion capture suits, was totally non-Instagrammable. And sometimes you would even see the curators were also posting a photograph, and in this feed that was all colors and images, and you'll see this black image with some white dots, and it was totally not appealing, or didn't function well for that medium. So but I still also shared it. So I think it's okay if you try to circulate something that is not really meant specifically for that medium. In that sense, that's why I don't forbid documentation, but I think selling it as artwork is very different than still. It enters into a different kind of economy, than if you just post something online. That's really just a documentation. Yes. It has, this purpose of advertising, let's say, or saying this is happening, but it's not the work.
Yeah, it certainly has there is always the promotional associations of putting especially your own work on Instagram. But do you look at do you look and see how people are representing your work on Instagram? Or does that not interest you?
Not so much, no.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe sometimes you look and see, or if you use a hashtag, you check it. But I'm not obsessing with how, I'm not trying also to control, how it's being.
I mean, I think a certain sector of artists really don't like their work being fragmented and they would say misrepresented. And this is something that seems inevitable with social media, is that the video clips can only be, 10, 15 seconds at most. But
exactly, I mean, can you control that anyway? I don't know, I don't want to start. And I don't think it's even, I think it's just, it becomes such a marketing strategy, if you just try to police this aspect. It's there, it's going to happen. I think the point is to really try to produce a situation where actually people are not so much invited to just take out their phones. So maybe you are really interested in what is happening there and you forget you have to Instagram it. That's more interesting.
What are your strategies for that? I mean, intimacy and directness is one, to create try and create a direct relationship or eye contact with the audience that can inhibit the immediate taking out of the phone.
I don't know. I mean, there's nothing that I do specifically for that. And actually, I'm not really a fan of very interactive works or participatory. Yeah. So I don't know. It's not so much about participation, I think. I guess it's just that, yeah, there's something interesting and intriguing unfolding there, where you sense there is some sort of layered content and an interesting intention there.
I've been interested in this in my research because I think there is a convergence, or at least a similar. Like they've happened at the same moment, that the desire to make performance continually present within a gallery or museum space has arisen at almost exactly the same moment that smartphones and camera phones and the iPhone. So, for example, the first exhibitions of what I would call dance exhibitions, the prolongation of performance to fill exhibition opening hours, started to take place around 2007, which is exactly when the iPhone is introduced. And of course, this, there is an internal logic to dance and performance that has led to this, but this fruitful convergence of the smartphone and this type of work is, I think, part of its popularity and part of its high visibility at the moment. But on another level, I think there's also a deeper way in which digital technology is producing a certain logic around the structure of these works. Which is also very paradoxical, because for the most part, performance and dance exhibitions within gallery spaces are very de-technologized. They're very stripped back. I think did you use the word stripped back or reduced? Or as I mentioned earlier, there's very rarely specific lighting, specific sound, amplification, or so on. In fact, they're often quite inhospitable spaces for performers, and the performance tends to be just a degree zero of bodies moving in a space. And at the same time, though, there needs to be a means of organizing those bodies for the duration of exhibition opening hours. And that's where I think what I call a kind of unconscious digital logic comes into it, of primarily the loop being the most obvious way in which that time is organized. But then I'm also interested in the algorithm as a way of doing that, and you're one of the few people who I think has really tried to explore the algorithm as a means of structuring time. But I'd also say there's a real difference between the way in which you've done it and the way in which artists like Tino Sehgal or Philip Pereno have tried to use the algorithm as a way of structuring time. In that, well, Pereno is very technological, Tino less so, although I don't know, with his piece at Tate Modern, it was also about using the lighting system of the turbine hall to signal when changes were taking place for the performers. But I think they take it out of the viewer's hands, whereas I think you're trying to bring some kind of viewer agency back into the mechanism of chance that underpins the algorithm. I don't know. Talk about algorithms.
I just wanted to briefly comment on something when you said that that the works are stripped down, so it's just the performance, no lighting, no. I think it also has to do with economics again. So the fact that you choose to put all the budget into performers' fees. So you're not really interested. Again, because then you wonder, what happens with these objects in the gallery? So you create a set, right, a stage design. What happens with the objects? Where do they go? How do they enter them? How does the work then enters the market? Do you sell the objects? Do you sell the remnants of the work? Or do you actually try to sell the work, which means you try to have the work reactivated and again other performers paid and so on. So I think it also has to do with this decision to strip things of all the stuff that could be easily circulated.
Although there is a space, I mean, there's a hybrid space there that can also be very productive. I'm thinking of the Guy de Cointet and the way his paintings are also function as props, but also as standalone works that can be reactivated or not. Anyway, I'm just maybe.
But I think it's all, as long as we talk about politics, it's always important to talk about how the work circulates and what it produces, how it enters the market, how it's being funded, and so on.
Okay,
so,
but we've moved on from algorithms.
Yes.
Tell me how you think about the algorithm as a way of structuring work.
I mean, maybe it's easier to talk through this example of the work for last year's Berlin Biennale, which was called Signals. It was, again, a work that was enactment-based with 4 performers in the exhibition space. 4 or 5. I'm sorry. I think actually 5, sorry, with 5 performers in the exhibition space. It was again made for a black box, but with this lighting system that would actually light up reflective markers on performers' motion capture suits. So the performers were wearing these black motion capture suits. Motion capture technology is this technology of basically extracting movement and energy, movement geometries out of a moving subject and having it circulate independently of the body. You could produce avatars. I mean, actually, Avatar is the first film in which the technology was used at large. So there is a process of abstraction, right? That the body, from its very concrete presence and materiality, it becomes a series of coordinates, of light points in space that the cameras, usually infrared cameras, record, and then they're able to,
But in this case, you had no cameras recording.
No, so there was no camera, but I was trying to produce this effect for the human eye. So basically you had these reflective markers on the motion capture suits and then this series of LED lights that were placed somehow close to your eye level, as close to the eye level as possible, so as to send light into the markers, and then the light would reflect back into your eye. So basically, depending on how far the performers are from you, you can see them very concretely, and you can see their facial expressions and everything. And the further away they move from you, they become a series of light points in the dark. So because costumes are black, and it's a black box. So
but maybe more importantly, what they were doing in the space.
Yes, I'm getting there, but somehow it's related. It's a bit more, it's more to talk about. And what they were enacting were, the content was selected in this way. We had a pool of content, a series of, I think, 100 possible enactments, stories that were organized as stories, as Facebook stories, like headlines or something like that. And that were listed online on the Biennale's website, and also on a website that I run. And that users can click on. And whenever they click on, their click is registered as a preference. And we had an algorithm that ranked all these clicks according to some parameters that were somehow mimicking EdgeRank, but also transforming or like changing. Let's say, mimicking EdgeRank according to our possibilities, but still trying to follow, for example, trying to consider geographical location, time spent on website, the device that you used. We ranked lower people who interacted from their iPhones, for example, just assuming that, they're wealthier. So you want to balance out influence. So again, one of the points was to reveal the political decisions that are implied by creating parameters for these algorithms that rank and produce hierarchies of information online. So all this kind of complicated process of making a decision for 30 most relevant stories that would be performed in the exhibition space every day was also made visible in the exhibition space. So if you had time and you wanted to understand how this all works, you would see according to what we ranked and what parameters we use, and then you try to understand why are these stories and these enactments performed today.
Okay. So why did this need to be in the dark?
It was very technical. It was a technical reason. So I wanted the bodies to disappear in the darkness and to appear according to their. It's not really in the dark, so there is light in the space. It's just because it's a black box and the costumes are black. The further away they are from the light, the more they disappear in the darkness. The closer they come to the light, the more they appear. So it was basically this process of abstraction from concrete material, concrete bodies to movement geometries that I think was similar to the process of abstraction that takes place online, in which information is basically considered as signals and completely abstract by these algorithms that do not register meaning. And you had all these discussions, I don't know, about someone's post about the daughter who died, right? And then that got, I don't know, viral, and then, you have these memories on Facebook. And Facebook, after a year, considered that this was a viral post, and it was interesting. So maybe this person wants to be reminded of that, because if it was popular, it was happy, for sure. And it came back in this person's feed, and it was, of course, Yeah, another drama. So.
Okay, so you're trying to have a more kind of a critical relationship to the algorithm. I mean, I think about other artists who use algorithms as well. Or, for example, someone I'm in dialogue with in New York is Annie Dawson, who works on algorithmic theatre. But I think for her, it's really a post-humanist position to take decision making away from the human and to hand it over to technology. But I think what you're describing is something different.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, at a certain point, it becomes post-human because you can't really follow all the logics together. You don't really understand how it makes decisions, but you decide according to what it makes these decisions. And of course, I think now only recently these discussions about the politics of algorithmic governance and decision-making started to enter the mainstream, but it's not something that everybody is aware of. And you had, I don't know, biased results in terms of job offers for women or men, and why does Google show this for women and this for, of course, because of, I know, personalized search and database and how the algorithm is constructed to consider certain parameters and so on. So it's actually quite complex, and it's very political, I think.